Picture this: you're crouched in the shadows of a medieval cathedral, a blade hidden beneath your robes, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The romantic notion of the medieval assassin conjures images of silent killers moving like ghosts through torchlit corridors, masters of death who commanded fear and respect. But here's the brutal truth that history books rarely tell you: being a medieval assassin was quite possibly one of the most miserable, terrifying, and short-lived professions in human history. The reality was far from the romanticized tales we've been fed. These weren't the smooth operators of modern fiction. They were desperate men and women living in constant terror, knowing that every sunrise might be their last, every meal could be their final one, and every shadow might conceal their own executioner. Let's start with the most obvious problem. Medieval assassins were essentially walking dead men. The moment you accepted your first contract, you painted a target on your back that would never disappear. Unlike modern criminals who might escape justice through legal loopholes or geographic distance, medieval society was small, interconnected, and unforgiving. Kill a lord's son, and that lord wouldn't just put a bounty on your head. He'd mobilize his entire network of allies, servants, and mercenaries to hunt you down like a rabid dog. The medieval world operated on a principle of collective responsibility and blood vengeance that made privacy impossible. Everyone knew everyone else's business. The baker knew which nobles visited which brothels, the blacksmith knew who was buying weapons, and the tavern keeper knew who was spending suspiciously large amounts of coin. An assassin couldn't simply blend into the crowd because there was no crowd to blend into. Medieval communities were tight-knit surveillance networks where strangers stood out like torches in the darkness. Consider the case of Hugh de Morville, one of the knights who murdered Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170. You might think that killing an archbishop would be the end of his story, but the real nightmare was just beginning. Despite having royal backing initially, de Morville spent the rest of his life as a hunted man. He was excommunicated, which meant he was essentially dead to medieval society. No one could legally help him, trade with him, or even speak to him without risking their own souls. He eventually died on a crusade to the Holy Land, but even that wasn't enough to cleanse his reputation. His family name was tainted for generations. But the social consequences were just the beginning of an assassin's troubles. The actual logistics of medieval murder were nightmare fuel. There were no silencers, no long-range sniper rifles, no poison that couldn't be detected by taste. Medieval assassins had to get up close and personal with their victims, and that meant facing trained warriors who were likely better armed, better trained, and surrounded by loyal guards. Medieval nobles weren't sitting ducks. They were professional soldiers who had been training for combat since childhood. They wore armor, carried weapons, and traveled with retinues of equally dangerous men. Getting close enough to kill one meant infiltrating a heavily defended social circle where everyone was suspicious of outsiders. It meant learning complex social protocols, mastering accents and dialects, and somehow acquiring the expensive clothing and accessories that marked social status. The clothing alone was a barrier most assassins couldn't overcome. Medieval society was rigidly hierarchical, and your social position was immediately visible in what you wore. The wrong fabric, the wrong cut, the wrong accessories would mark you as an imposter instantly. Silk was restricted to the nobility, certain colors were regulated by law, and even the way you tied your belt could reveal your social origins. An assassin trying to infiltrate noble society was like a modern person trying to sneak into a black tie event wearing a tracksuit. The disguise had to be perfect, expensive, and convincing to dozens of people who had grown up in that social environment. Even if an assassin somehow managed to get close to their target, the actual act of murder presented horrifying challenges. Medieval weapons were crude and unreliable. Swords required tremendous skill and strength to use effectively. Daggers meant getting within arm's reach of your victim, close enough to smell their breath and see the fear in their eyes. Poison was unreliable and often as dangerous to the poisoner as to the victim. Many medieval toxins required fresh preparation and careful handling that could easily go wrong. The psychological toll was perhaps the worst part. Medieval assassins lived in a constant state of paranoia that would drive most people insane. They couldn't trust anyone, couldn't form lasting relationships, and couldn't even trust their own employers. The person who hired you to kill someone today might decide tomorrow that you know too much and need to be eliminated yourself. It was a profession that attracted the desperate and the damaged, but even the most hardened criminals struggled with the isolation and fear. Sleep became impossible. Every creaking floorboard, every unexpected knock, every hooded figure in the street could be death approaching. Medieval houses offered little security. Locks were primitive and easily broken. Windows were often just shuttered openings. Doors were wooden barriers that could be kicked in by a determined attacker. An assassin's home was never a sanctuary. It was just another trap waiting to be sprung. The constant stress manifested in physical symptoms that medieval medicine couldn't address. Chronic insomnia led to hallucinations and paranoid delusions. Poor nutrition from never being able to eat in public or accept food from others led to malnutrition and disease. The inability to seek medical treatment for injuries sustained during jobs meant that minor wounds often became infected and life-threatening. But perhaps the most crushing aspect of an assassin's life was the complete absence of any safety net. Medieval society was built around networks of mutual obligation and support. Families, guilds, churches, and feudal relationships provided security and assistance when times were hard. An assassin had to abandon all of these connections. They couldn't rely on family without putting their loved ones in danger. They couldn't join guilds because their profession was inherently solitary and illegal. They couldn't seek sanctuary in churches because most of their victims were protected by ecclesiastical law. This isolation meant that any setback could be fatal. An injury that would be minor for a normal person could be a death sentence for an assassin who couldn't seek proper medical care. An illness that would require a few days of rest and care could become fatal when you had no one to tend to you. Even simple bad luck, like losing your money or having your equipment stolen, could leave you completely helpless. The financial aspects were equally brutal. Despite what popular culture suggests, most assassins weren't wealthy. The market for their services was limited and extremely dangerous. Clients who could afford to hire assassins were usually wealthy and powerful, which meant they were also dangerous and unpredictable. They might decide to eliminate the assassin rather than pay them, especially if the job went wrong or if they feared the assassin might betray them later. Payment often came in forms that were difficult to use safely. Large amounts of gold or silver were suspicious and hard to explain. Valuable objects had to be fenced through criminal networks that were unreliable and dangerous. Many assassins found themselves caught between clients who wouldn't pay and criminals who would cheat them, with no legal recourse in either case. The few assassins who did manage to accumulate wealth faced new problems. How do you enjoy riches when you can't live openly? How do you spend money when every purchase might be traced back to you? How do you plan for the future when you might not survive the next month? Many successful assassins ended up living like misers, hoarding wealth they could never safely spend while living in constant fear of discovery. Training and skill development were nearly impossible. Unlike legitimate professions that had formal apprenticeships and training programs, assassins had to learn their deadly craft through trial and error, often fatal error. There were no schools for murder, no master assassins willing to take on students, no safe environments to practice techniques. Every job was potentially your first and last lesson. This lack of formal training meant that most assassins were amateurs who relied more on luck than skill. They made mistakes that professional soldiers would never make. They chose poor targets, used inappropriate weapons, and failed to plan adequate escape routes. The few who survived long enough to develop real expertise were usually so paranoid and damaged by their experiences that they couldn't function as effective teachers even if they wanted to. The weapons available to medieval assassins were limited and problematic. Swords were expensive, difficult to conceal, and required years of training to use effectively. A poorly trained swordsman facing a professional warrior was essentially committing suicide. Daggers were more accessible but required getting extremely close to the target, which was often impossible given the security surrounding important people. Crossbows offered range but were slow to reload, inaccurate beyond short distances, and extremely difficult to conceal. The bolts were distinctive and could be traced back to their maker. Bows required tremendous skill and strength to use effectively, and arrows were even more traceable than crossbow bolts. Most importantly, both crossbows and bows required clear lines of sight and escape routes that were rarely available in the crowded, chaotic environments where targets could be found. Poison seemed like an elegant solution, but medieval toxins were unreliable and dangerous to handle. Most effective poisons were derived from plants or minerals that were rare, expensive, and difficult to obtain without attracting attention. The preparation required knowledge that was closely guarded by physicians and apothecaries who were unlikely to share it with obvious criminals. Even when assassins managed to acquire poison, dosage was largely guesswork. Too little and the victim would survive and identify their attacker. Too much and the poison might be detected by taste or smell before it could take effect. The delivery methods for poison were equally problematic. Food had to be prepared and served by trusted servants who were unlikely to cooperate with strangers. Drink could be tested by food tasters, a common practice among the wealthy and paranoid. Direct application required physical contact that was nearly impossible to arrange safely. Many would-be poisoners ended up accidentally killing themselves while preparing or administering their weapons. Environmental hazards made every job exponentially more dangerous. Medieval cities were mazes of narrow streets, dead ends, and easily blocked passages. A successful assassination was worthless if you couldn't escape afterward. The lack of reliable lighting meant that nighttime operations were conducted in near-total darkness, making navigation treacherous and increasing the likelihood of accidents or getting lost. Weather was an unpredictable enemy. Rain made climbing surfaces slippery and dangerous. Snow left tracks that could be followed for miles. Wind could carry sounds further than expected, alerting guards or bystanders to your presence. Extreme heat or cold affected the performance of both the assassin and their equipment in ways that could turn a carefully planned operation into a disaster. The primitive state of medieval medicine meant that even minor injuries sustained during a job could become life-threatening. A small cut could become infected and kill you slowly and painfully. A broken bone might heal incorrectly, leaving you permanently disabled. Internal injuries from falls or fights were often fatal because medieval physicians had no way to diagnose or treat them effectively. Disease was a constant threat that was amplified by an assassin's lifestyle. The stress of living in constant fear weakened the immune system. Poor nutrition from irregular meals and unsafe food sources made the body more susceptible to illness. The inability to seek proper medical care meant that treatable conditions often became fatal. Many assassins who survived the dangers of their profession succumbed to diseases that would have been minor inconveniences for ordinary people. The legal system of medieval Europe was designed to crush people like assassins. There was no presumption of innocence, no right to legal representation, and no protection against self-incrimination. Trials were often formalities that preceded execution. Torture was not only legal but expected as a means of extracting confessions. The various methods of judicial torture were designed to be as painful and terrifying as possible, and few people could withstand them long enough to maintain their innocence. Even if an assassin somehow avoided capture, the legal consequences extended far beyond their own life. Medieval law recognized the concept of blood guilt, which meant that an assassin's family could be held responsible for their crimes. Children could be executed for their parents' sins. Property could be confiscated from entire extended families. The stigma of association with an assassin could destroy the lives of innocent people for generations. The Church's involvement in medieval justice made escape even more difficult. Excommunication was a death sentence that extended into the afterlife. An excommunicated person was cut off from all sacraments, which meant they couldn't receive last rites, couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, and couldn't hope for salvation. For people who genuinely believed in eternal damnation, this spiritual isolation was often worse than physical death. Religious sanctuary, which might have provided temporary refuge for other criminals, was usually denied to assassins. Churches were reluctant to harbor people whose crimes were so heinous that they threatened the social order. Even when sanctuary was granted, it was temporary and conditional. The assassin would eventually have to leave the church grounds and face justice. The international nature of medieval justice made geographic escape nearly impossible. The Catholic Church provided a communication network that spanned all of Europe. A crime committed in England could be known in Rome within weeks. Diplomatic relationships between noble houses meant that a fugitive assassin could be recognized and arrested in foreign territories. The small size of medieval communities meant that strangers were always noticed and remembered. But let's dig deeper into the daily reality of living as a medieval assassin, because the mundane details reveal just how nightmarish this existence truly was. Imagine waking up every morning not knowing if today would be the day someone finally caught up with you. Your first thought isn't about breakfast or the weather, it's about scanning every shadow, every face, every sound for signs of danger. This hypervigilance becomes so exhausting that many assassins developed what we might now recognize as severe anxiety disorders and PTSD. Though medieval medicine had no names for these conditions and no treatments beyond prayer and bloodletting. The simple act of acquiring food became a deadly game of chess. You couldn't establish regular patterns by visiting the same markets or taverns, because patterns could be predicted and exploited by your enemies. You couldn't trust food prepared by others, because poison was always a possibility. Yet you also couldn't survive on foraged foods or basic provisions indefinitely without your health deteriorating. This created a cruel paradox. The very sustenance you needed to survive could be the weapon used to kill you. Many assassins developed elaborate food testing rituals that bordered on obsessive compulsion. They would carry small animals like rats or birds to test unfamiliar food, but this practice was both conspicuous and unreliable. Some poisons worked differently on different species, and the delay between consumption and symptoms meant that a test might give false confidence. Others resorted to eating only foods they could prepare themselves from raw ingredients they personally selected, but this severely limited their mobility and made them predictable in new ways. The acquisition of basic supplies became exponentially more complex than for ordinary people. An assassin needed specialized equipment, weapons, armor if they could afford it, disguises, lockpicks, rope, and various tools of the trade. But they couldn't simply walk into a blacksmith shop and order a set of throwing knives without raising suspicions. They couldn't commission custom leather armor without explaining why they needed it. Every purchase had to be carefully planned and executed through intermediaries or criminal networks that were themselves unreliable and dangerous. This need for criminal contacts created another layer of vulnerability. To survive as an assassin, you had to build relationships with forgers, weaponsmiths, information brokers, and fences who operated outside the law. But these people were criminals themselves, motivated by profit rather than loyalty. They might betray you for money, use you as a scapegoat for their own crimes, or simply decide that you were too dangerous to keep alive. Every criminal contact was a potential executioner waiting for the right moment to strike. The forged documents that assassins needed to maintain their cover identities were particularly problematic. Medieval bureaucracy was more sophisticated than most people realize, with complex systems of seals, signatures, and verification that were difficult to reproduce convincingly. Church records, guild memberships, letters of introduction, and travel permits all had specific formats and authentication methods that varied by region and authority. A skilled forger might be able to create documents that would fool casual inspection, but any serious scrutiny could expose the deception and lead to immediate arrest. Travel presented its own set of nightmarish challenges. Medieval roads were dangerous for everyone, but assassins faced additional hazards that made every journey potentially fatal. They couldn't travel with large groups for protection, because groups attracted attention and scrutiny. They couldn't use established trade routes and inns, because these were monitored by authorities and criminals alike. They couldn't seek help from local communities when things went wrong, because their presence might be reported to enemies who were searching for them. The primitive state of medieval transportation meant that most travel was done on foot, which was slow, exhausting, and left travelers vulnerable to weather, wild animals, and bandits. Horses were expensive, required care and feeding that was difficult to arrange discreetly, and were so valuable that they attracted the attention of thieves. A horse also limited your options for hiding or escaping on foot when necessary, and the animal's needs could force you into dangerous situations where you had to interact with strangers. River travel was faster but exposed you to different dangers. Boat captains were notorious for their willingness to rob passengers or turn them over to authorities for bounties. River pirates were common on many waterways, and an assassin traveling alone was an easy target. Weather could strand you in unfamiliar territory where your presence would be noticed and questioned. Even successful river journeys often ended at ports where authorities maintained surveillance and records of travelers. Winter travel was particularly brutal for medieval assassins. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was potentially fatal. Hypothermia could kill you slowly while you were still conscious and trying to function. Frostbite could cripple your hands or feet, ending your career and probably your life. Snow made tracking easy for pursuers while making your own progress slow and exhausting. Ice made climbing or running treacherous, and a slip at the wrong moment could mean capture or death. The shortened daylight hours of winter meant more time spent in darkness, when dangers multiplied and navigation became much more difficult. Medieval cities and towns didn't have street lighting, so winter nights were periods of nearly complete blackness broken only by occasional torches or lanterns. An assassin moving through these environments was essentially blind, relying on memory and luck to avoid obstacles, guards, and other hazards. Food preservation was another winter nightmare. Without refrigeration, assassins had to rely on salted, dried, or pickled foods that were expensive, conspicuous to carry in large quantities, and nutritionally inadequate for maintaining health during strenuous activity. Fresh food was scarce and expensive in winter, and the markets where it could be obtained were closely watched by authorities who knew that desperate people would be forced to take risks. The psychological impact of seasonal depression was something medieval assassins had to endure without understanding or treatment. The combination of limited sunlight, social isolation, constant stress, and poor nutrition created a perfect storm for mental health deterioration. Many assassins who survived the physical dangers of summer would be found dead in winter, apparent suicides who couldn't endure another season of darkness and despair. Spring brought different challenges as the world awakened from winter dormancy. Increased travel and trade meant more opportunities for work, but also more competition from other criminals and more surveillance from authorities who were preparing for the active season. The melting snow revealed evidence of winter activities that had been hidden, including bodies, hidden supplies, and tracks that could be followed. Many assassins who thought they had successfully hidden their winter activities found themselves exposed when the snow melted. The renewal of plant life in spring created new opportunities for poison makers, but also new dangers. Fresh toxins were more potent but also more difficult to identify and dose correctly. The abundance of new growth made it easier to hide but also provided cover for enemies who might be hunting you. The longer days provided more working time but also more opportunities for surveillance and pursuit. Summer brought its own unique torments. The heat made wearing disguises uncomfortable and suspicious, especially the heavy clothing often necessary to conceal weapons. Increased outdoor activity meant more witnesses to worry about, more guards patrolling, and more opportunities for random encounters that could expose your identity. The longer days meant less darkness to conceal your activities, forcing assassins to work in broad daylight or compress their operations into brief summer nights. Disease spread more rapidly in summer heat, and an assassin's compromised immune system made them particularly vulnerable to plagues and infections that swept through medieval communities. The inability to seek proper medical care meant that summer illnesses that would be minor inconveniences for others could become fatal for assassins. The heat also affected the preservation of foods and medicines, making it difficult to maintain adequate supplies during extended operations. The seasonal cycle created a relentless pattern of changing dangers that never allowed assassins to fully adapt or find security. Just as they developed strategies for dealing with one season's challenges, those strategies would become obsolete or counterproductive as conditions changed. This constant need for adaptation was mentally and physically exhausting, wearing down even the most resilient individuals over time. But perhaps the most soul-crushing aspect of an assassin's life was the complete absence of genuine human connection. Medieval society was built around relationships, family bonds, feudal loyalties, guild memberships, religious communities, and neighborhood networks. These connections provided not just practical support but also meaning and identity. An assassin had to sever all of these ties, becoming a ghost haunting the edges of human society. The isolation went beyond simple loneliness. Humans are social creatures who need interaction, validation, and emotional support to maintain psychological health. An assassin couldn't form friendships because friends could be used against them. They couldn't maintain romantic relationships because lovers could betray them or become targets themselves. They couldn't even have casual acquaintanceships because any familiarity could be dangerous. This emotional starvation led to profound psychological deterioration that medieval people couldn't understand or treat. Many assassins developed paranoid delusions, believing that everyone was plotting against them, or that they were being followed constantly. Others swung in the opposite direction, becoming recklessly trusting and making fatal mistakes with people who seemed friendly. The lack of normal social feedback made it difficult to gauge appropriate behavior or responses to social situations. The absence of purpose beyond mere survival was equally destructive. Most medieval people found meaning in their work, their families, their faith, or their communities. An assassin's work was inherently destructive and morally corrupting. Their isolation prevented them from forming meaningful relationships. Their profession put them at odds with religious teachings about the sanctity of life. Their existence contributed nothing positive to any community. This meaninglessness ate away at the soul like acid. Many assassins who physically survived their careers were broken mentally and spiritually, hollow shells of humanity who had forgotten what it meant to live rather than simply exist. They had traded their humanity for a profession that offered nothing in return but fear, isolation, and an early grave. The few assassins who tried to retire faced their own unique set of horrors. How do you reintegrate into society when you've spent years or decades living outside it? How do you explain the gaps in your history, the scars on your body, the nervous habits you've developed? How do you trust others when paranoia has become second nature? How do you sleep peacefully when you've spent so long expecting death in the darkness? Many retired assassins found that leaving the profession was harder than entering it. The skills they had developed were useless for legitimate work. The psychological damage they had sustained made normal relationships impossible. The enemies they had made didn't forget or forgive just because they stopped taking contracts. Retirement often meant trading the active dangers of the profession for the slow torture of trying to pretend to be human again. The few who managed successful transitions often did so by becoming hermits, or joining monastic communities where their damaged psyches could be hidden behind religious devotion, and their violent pasts could be framed as sins they were trying to atone for. But even in these refuges, they carried the weight of their actions and the knowledge that their peace was temporary and conditional. The medieval world's understanding of mental health was so primitive that the psychological destruction caused by the assassin's lifestyle was interpreted as demonic possession, divine punishment, or moral weakness. There were no therapists to help process trauma, no medications to treat anxiety or depression, no support groups for people trying to recover from extreme experiences. An assassin who survived physically but was broken mentally had no hope of healing or recovery. This brings us to one of the most overlooked aspects of medieval assassination, the sheer incompetence that characterized most practitioners. Popular culture has created an image of medieval assassins as skilled professionals, but the historical reality is that most were bumbling amateurs whose failures were as spectacular as they were deadly. The very nature of the profession attracted people who were desperate, damaged, or delusional, and these psychological states rarely produced competent killers. Consider the case of John Felton, who assassinated the Duke of Buckingham in 1628. While technically beyond our medieval period, his case illustrates the type of mentality that characterized medieval assassins. Felton was a failed soldier nursing personal grievances who convinced himself that murder would solve his problems and make him a hero. He had no plan beyond the actual killing, no escape route, and no understanding of the consequences. He was captured immediately and executed, having accomplished nothing except destroying his own life and traumatizing everyone around him. Medieval records are full of similar stories of assassination attempts that failed in spectacular and often comical ways. Assassins who accidentally killed the wrong person because they couldn't properly identify their targets in poor lighting. Killers who poisoned themselves while preparing toxins. Murderers who fell off roofs while trying to infiltrate buildings. The incompetence was so widespread that successful assassinations were often attributed to divine intervention or supernatural assistance, because observers couldn't believe that ordinary humans could accomplish such tasks. The training problem was fundamental and unsolvable. Unlike legitimate professions that had established apprenticeship systems and institutional knowledge, assassination skills had to be learned through trial and error. The few people who possessed the necessary knowledge were unlikely to share it, both because they were competitors and because teaching assassination was itself a capital crime. This meant that each assassin had to reinvent the wheel, learning basic techniques through experiments that often proved fatal. The weapons training alone would have taken years to master properly, time that most assassins didn't have. Swordsmanship was a lifelong pursuit that required constant practice and professional instruction. Archery demanded enormous upper body strength and thousands of hours of practice to achieve useful accuracy. Even knife fighting, which seemed simple, required understanding of anatomy, precise muscle control, and the ability to strike accurately while under extreme stress. Most medieval assassins never achieved even basic competence with their weapons. They relied on surprise and luck rather than skill, which meant their success rate was abysmal. Archaeological evidence from medieval battlefields shows that most wounds were inflicted by trained soldiers using weapons they had mastered through years of practice. The wounds attributed to assassins or criminal violence show a different pattern: hesitation marks, defensive wounds, and evidence of prolonged struggles that suggest the attackers were neither skilled nor confident. The psychological preparation for violence was equally inadequate. Modern military training includes extensive psychological conditioning to overcome the natural human reluctance to kill. Medieval assassins had no such training and often discovered at the crucial moment that they couldn't bring themselves to commit murder. Historical accounts describe assassins who approached their targets successfully but then hesitated, fled, or broke down emotionally when faced with the reality of taking a human life. This psychological barrier was particularly strong in medieval society, where most people lived in small communities where everyone knew everyone else. The social bonds and moral conditioning that held these communities together made violence against familiar people extremely difficult. An assassin targeting someone from their own community had to overcome not just technical challenges but deep psychological programming that made such violence feel unnatural and wrong. The few assassins who did manage to overcome this barrier often did so by becoming psychologically damaged in ways that made them less effective rather than more dangerous. They might become sadistic and cruel, taking unnecessary risks to prolong their victims' suffering. They might become paranoid and unstable, seeing enemies everywhere and making irrational decisions. They might become addicted to violence itself, taking unnecessary jobs that exposed them to capture or death. The planning phase of medieval assassinations revealed another layer of incompetence that would be laughable if it weren't so tragic. Most assassins had no concept of operational security, risk assessment, or contingency planning. They would discuss their plans openly in taverns, leave evidence at crime scenes, and follow predictable patterns that made them easy to track and capture. The intelligence gathering that should have preceded any assassination attempt was usually non-existent or dangerously inadequate. Assassins would base their plans on rumors, gossip, and assumptions rather than careful observation and verification. They would attempt to kill targets without understanding their schedules, security arrangements, or personal habits. They would assume that buildings had exits that didn't exist, that guards followed routines they hadn't observed, and that their targets would be vulnerable at times when they were actually well protected. The timing of assassination attempts was usually terrible. Assassins would strike during festivals when security was heightened, or during periods of political tension when everyone was expecting violence. They would choose locations that were easily surrounded or escape routes that were likely to be blocked. They would attempt complex operations during bad weather that made their already difficult tasks nearly impossible. The aftermath planning was consistently the weakest aspect of medieval assassination attempts. Most assassins focused entirely on the killing itself and gave little or no thought to what would happen afterward. They had no safe houses, no false identities prepared, no money set aside for extended periods of hiding. They would commit murders and then return to their normal routines as if nothing had happened, making their capture inevitable. This lack of planning extended to the political and social consequences of their actions. Assassins rarely understood the complex web of relationships and obligations that surrounded their targets. Killing one person might trigger blood feuds that would last for generations, destabilize entire regions, or provoke massive retaliation against innocent communities. The assassin might succeed in killing their target only to discover that they had made the situation worse for everyone involved, including themselves. The economic aspects of medieval assassination were equally poorly understood by most practitioners. The cost of weapons, equipment, bribes, and safe passage often exceeded the payment offered for the job, especially when the hidden costs of maintaining security and anonymity were factored in. Many assassins found themselves financially ruined by successful operations, forced to take increasingly dangerous jobs to pay for the expenses of their previous work. The market for assassination services was much smaller and more volatile than most assassins realized. The number of people wealthy enough to hire killers was limited, and these potential clients were often connected to each other through family, political, or business relationships. An assassin who developed a reputation for success might find that their notoriety made them unemployable, because clients feared being associated with someone so widely known and hunted. The competition from other criminals was fierce and often lethal. Established criminal organizations didn't appreciate freelance assassins operating in their territories, and they had the resources and connections to eliminate interlopers quickly and efficiently. Many aspiring assassins found themselves dead not because they had been caught by authorities, but because they had been murdered by other criminals who saw them as threats or opportunities. The relationship between assassins and their clients was inherently unstable and dangerous. Clients who hired killers were usually desperate, paranoid, or ruthless individuals who were unlikely to be trustworthy employers. They might refuse to pay after the job was completed, claiming the work was unsatisfactory or that circumstances had changed. They might decide to eliminate the assassin to prevent future blackmail or testimony. They might use the assassin as a scapegoat for other crimes or political problems. The negotiation process, most died alone, in poverty, hunted by multiple enemies and abandoned by former allies. Their bodies were often left unburied because no one was willing to risk association with them even in death. Their possessions were scattered by scavengers or confiscated by authorities. Their names were forgotten or remembered only as cautionary tales. They had traded everything that made life meaningful for a profession that offered nothing in return but suffering and an early grave. The broader historical lesson of medieval assassination is perhaps most relevant to our modern world. Violence begets violence, and those who choose to solve problems through murder inevitably create more problems than they solve. The medieval assassins who thought they were heroes or problem solvers were actually agents of chaos whose actions made the world worse for everyone, including themselves. Their stories serve as stark reminders that there are no shortcuts to justice, no quick fixes for complex social problems, and no sustainable careers built on the destruction of human life. In the end, the medieval assassin represents one of history's most complete examples of a self-defeating profession. Every aspect of the work was designed to destroy the person who performed it. The skills required were impossible to develop safely, the working conditions were unbearable, the pay was inadequate, the career prospects were non-existent, and the final outcome was invariably death or madness. It was a profession that attracted the desperate and the damaged, then systematically destroyed whatever remained of their humanity. The romantic myths that have grown up around medieval assassins serve mainly to obscure these harsh realities and perpetuate dangerous fantasies about violence and power. The truth is far more sobering. Being a medieval assassin was quite possibly the worst job in human history, a profession so thoroughly awful that it defied every rational principle of career choice and personal survival. It was a path that led nowhere but down, a choice that guaranteed suffering without offering any compensating rewards worth the price paid to obtain them. So the next time you encounter a story or movie that glorifies the medieval assassin, remember the reality behind the romance. Remember the paranoia, the isolation, the constant fear, the physical suffering, the spiritual corruption, and the inevitable violent death that awaited everyone who chose this path. Remember that these were not heroes or romantic figures but broken people who made terrible choices that destroyed not only their own lives but the lives of everyone around them. Their true legacy is not one of skill or courage but of waste, suffering, and the ultimately futile nature of trying to build a life on the foundation of others' deaths. The medieval world was harsh enough without adding the profession of assassination to its catalogue of human misery. Those who chose this path discovered that in trying to become masters of death, they had actually become its servants, trapped in cycles of violence that consumed everything they touched. In the end, the medieval assassin's greatest victim was always himself, and his greatest crime was the waste of a human life that might have contributed something positive to a world that desperately needed more light and less darkness. In the sands of time, among the mountain fortresses of Persia and Syria, there existed an order whose name still evokes both fear and fascination. The assassins were not merely killers, as their name might suggest, but a complex religious political organization that for 2 centuries played a pivotal role in the history of the Middle East during the Age of the Crusades. Their story is one of mysticism and politics, faith and violence, idealism and pragmatism intertwined in ways that continue to captivate historians and the public imagination alike. The word assassin derives from the Arabic hashishin, literally meaning users of hashish. Though this explanation, popular among European chroniclers, is likely a simplification or even distortion of reality. They called themselves fidai, those who sacrificed themselves, which more accurately reflects their worldview and mission. This semantic confusion has contributed to centuries of misunderstanding about their true nature and motivations. The assassins emerged during one of the most turbulent periods in Middle Eastern history, when the Islamic world was fragmenting under internal conflicts, while simultaneously facing the external threat of Christian crusaders. In this chaos, they carved out their own unique niche, becoming power brokers who could topple rulers with a single well-placed dagger while maintaining their mountain strongholds against vastly superior armies. The history of the assassins begins in the late 11th century with the enigmatic figure of Hassan I-Sabbah, a Persian nobleman and philosopher who became the founder and first leader of the order. Born around 1050 CE in the city of Qom, Hassan received an excellent education in Isfahan, where he studied theology, philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. His path to creating the order was long and circuitous, marked by intellectual searching and political maneuvering. In his youth, Hassan converted to Ismailism, a branch of Shia Islam that differed from the Sunni majority through its esoteric philosophy and revolutionary political ideas. Ismailis believed in a hidden imam who would return to establish justice on earth, and they maintained a complex system of allegorical interpretation of religious texts. This belief in secret knowledge and messianic destiny became the foundation for the future ideology of the assassins. After his conversion, Hassan embarked on a journey to Cairo, the center of the Ismaili Fatimid Caliphate, where he spent several years studying secret teachings and preparing for his mission. The Fatimid court was a center of learning and political intrigue, where Hassan absorbed lessons in both theology and statecraft that would serve him well in his later endeavors. During this period, he also witnessed firsthand the internal struggles that were weakening the Fatimid state, lessons that would influence his approach to building his own organization. Returning to Persia in 1081, Hassan began preaching among the population of the northern mountainous regions, where Sunni authority was weak and people suffered from social injustice. His message resonated particularly well with the rural poor and marginalized communities who saw in Ismailism a promise of spiritual and social liberation. Hassan was a charismatic speaker who could adapt his message to different audiences, presenting complex theological concepts in ways that ordinary people could understand and embrace. The pivotal moment in Assassin history came with the capture of Alamut Fortress in 1090. Located in the impregnable Elbrus Mountains, this stronghold became the heart of the future Assassin state. Hassan did not storm the fortress through military assault. Instead, he conquered it from within by converting the garrison and local population to his cause. This bloodless victory demonstrated the power of ideological warfare and set the pattern for future assassin expansion. The ideology of the assassins represented a sophisticated blend of Ismaili theology, Persian traditions, and revolutionary political ideas. At the center of their teaching lay the concept of talim, esoteric knowledge that was transmitted only to initiates through a strict hierarchy. This system of graduated revelation meant that different members of the organization had access to different levels of truth, creating both unity of purpose and security against infiltration. The order was structured according to 7 degrees of initiation. At the lowest levels were the fidai, the executors ready to sacrifice their lives for the cause. Above them were the rafiq, companions, then the dai, missionaries, and so forth up to the highest level of imam, who was considered the infallible leader of the community. This hierarchical structure was both a theological principle and a practical necessity for maintaining discipline and secrecy. Each level had access to a certain portion of secret knowledge. It was believed that only through complete submission to the hierarchy and gradual enlightenment could one approach ultimate truth. This system created intense loyalty among members while also serving as a form of quality control, ensuring that only the most dedicated and reliable individuals reached positions of real authority. The theological foundation of assassin belief rested on the Ismaili doctrine of the necessity of an infallible imam to guide the community. Unlike other Muslim groups who relied primarily on written revelation and scholarly interpretation, Ismailis emphasized the continuing guidance of a living, though often hidden, spiritual leader. This belief gave the assassins tremendous flexibility in adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining doctrinal coherence. Central to their worldview was the concept of spiritual warfare against injustice and ignorance. They saw themselves not as mere political actors but as soldiers in a cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood. This apocalyptic dimension of their beliefs helped justify extreme actions and gave individual assassins the courage to undertake suicide missions against seemingly impossible odds. The assassin organization was remarkably sophisticated for its time, combining religious authority with political pragmatism and military efficiency. At its head stood the Old Man of the Mountain, a title given to the leader of the Syrian branch of the order, though the supreme authority remained with the Imam in Alamut. This dual structure allowed for both centralized strategic direction and local tactical flexibility. The order maintained a network of fortresses throughout Persia and Syria, each serving as both military stronghold and center of religious instruction. These castles were marvels of medieval engineering, built in locations that were virtually impregnable to conventional assault. They were also centers of learning, containing libraries, laboratories, and workshops where members pursued both religious studies and practical skills. The famous Gardens of Paradise, described by European chroniclers, were likely real educational facilities where potential fidei were trained and indoctrinated. Rather than being drug-induced fantasies, these were probably sophisticated psychological preparation centers where young men were prepared for their dangerous missions through a combination of religious instruction, physical training, and psychological conditioning. The intelligence network of the assassins was perhaps their greatest asset. They maintained agents throughout the Middle East, from merchant princes to palace servants, who provided information about potential targets and political opportunities. This network was so effective that the assassins often knew about political developments before the rulers themselves, giving them tremendous strategic advantages. Training of the fidei was intensive and multifaceted. Beyond physical conditioning and weapons training, they learned languages, customs, and religious practices that would allow them to blend into their target environments. Many could pass as merchants, scholars, or religious pilgrims, maintaining their cover for months or even years before striking. This patience and attention to detail made them far more dangerous than ordinary assassins. The signature weapon of the assassins was the dagger, wielded with surgical precision in public places where the psychological impact would be maximized. But their true weapon was fear, the knowledge that assassin justice could reach anyone, anywhere, regardless of their power or protection. This reputation was carefully cultivated and became perhaps their most effective tool. The assassins pioneered what would today be called psychological warfare. Their targets were carefully chosen not just for immediate political impact but for the broader message they would send. The public nature of many assassinations was deliberate. They wanted everyone to witness the fate of those who opposed them. This created a climate of fear that often made actual violence unnecessary, as the mere threat of assassin attention was enough to change behavior. Their missions were characterized by meticulous planning and extraordinary patience. Assassins would sometimes spend years establishing their cover identities, building trust with their targets, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This long-term approach required tremendous discipline and dedication, qualities that were instilled through years of religious and psychological preparation. The organizational structure allowed for remarkable operational security. Most fidei knew only their immediate superiors and the details of their specific missions. This compartmentalization meant that the capture of individual operatives rarely compromised larger operations or revealed the full extent of the network. Hassan I-Sabbah himself remains the most enigmatic and important figure in assassin history. Ruling from Alamut for 34 years until his death in 1124, he transformed a small religious sect into a major political force. His famous declaration of the Great Resurrection, the abolition of Islamic law in favor of direct spiritual guidance, shocked the Muslim world and demonstrated the radical nature of assassin theology. Under Hassan's leadership, the assassins eliminated numerous political enemies, including Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuk Sultan. This assassination, carried out by a fidei disguised as a Sufi mystic, demonstrated both the reach of the organization and its willingness to target the highest levels of government. The political chaos that followed helped secure assassin independence and demonstrated the effectiveness of their methods. Rashid ad-Din Sinan, known to the Crusaders as the Old Man of the Mountain, led the Syrian branch of the order during its period of greatest influence. Under his leadership, the assassins became major players in the complex politics of the Crusader states, sometimes allying with Christian knights against Muslim rivals. Sinan's diplomatic skills were as formidable as his organization's military capabilities. The assassin's relationship with Saladin, the great Muslim leader, illustrates the complexity of medieval Middle Eastern politics. Initially enemies, they eventually reached an accommodation after Saladin survived several assassination attempts. The story of Saladin finding poisoned daggers by his bedside, a warning from the assassins, may be apocryphal, but it captures the psychological dimension of their power. The arrival of the Crusaders created new opportunities and challenges for the assassins. Unlike other Muslim groups who saw the Christians as unqualified enemies, the assassins were willing to negotiate and even ally with them when it served their interests. This pragmatic approach often put them at odds with other Muslims but demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of realpolitik. The assassins established diplomatic relations with several Crusader states, sometimes providing military support in exchange for tribute or territorial concessions. These alliances scandalized Orthodox Muslims, but made strategic sense for an organization surrounded by enemies. The Crusaders, for their part, learned to respect assassin power and often found it more practical to negotiate than to fight. European chroniclers left vivid accounts of their encounters with the assassins, though these accounts were often colored by fear, misunderstanding, and anti-Islamic prejudice. The image of the drug-crazed fanatic willing to die for a taste of paradise became a powerful stereotype in European literature, though it bore little resemblance to the sophisticated reality of the organization. The legend of the Gardens of Paradise. Elaborate training facilities where potential assassins were supposedly drugged and shown a preview of heavenly delights, captured European imaginations but was likely a misunderstanding of actual educational practices. The real source of assassin dedication was not drugs but a complex system of religious belief and social conditioning. The decline of the assassins began in the early 13th century, as changing political circumstances undermined their strategic position. The rise of more centralized Muslim states reduced the political fragmentation that had allowed them to thrive. The Ayyubid dynasty in particular proved more effective at countering assassin influence than their Seljuk predecessors. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century posed an existential threat to the entire order. Unlike previous enemies who could be negotiated with or intimidated, the Mongols showed no interest in accommodation. Hulagu Khan's systematic destruction of assassin fortresses in Persia between 1256 and 1258 effectively ended their power in that region. The last stand of the Persian assassins at Alamut has become legendary. Rukn al-Din Kursha, the final imam, attempted to negotiate with the Mongols but was ultimately betrayed and murdered. The destruction of Alamut's famous library, containing centuries of accumulated knowledge, was a cultural catastrophe that symbolized the end of an era. The Syrian branch of the order survived longer, adapting to Mamluk rule in the late 13th century. However, they gradually lost their independence and distinctive character, eventually being absorbed into mainstream Islamic society. By the 14th century, the assassins as an independent political force had ceased to exist. The historical impact of the assassins extends far beyond their relatively brief period of political prominence. They demonstrated that a small, well-organized group with clear objectives and sophisticated methods could exercise influence far beyond their numerical strength. This lesson has not been lost on subsequent political movements and organizations. Their contribution to the development of intelligence gathering and covert operations was significant. Many of their methods, the use of deep cover agents, psychological warfare, and targeted elimination of key figures, remain relevant to modern intelligence services. The assassins were among the first to understand that information and timing could be more valuable than superior numbers or conventional military strength. The intellectual legacy of the assassins is preserved in various Ismaili communities that survived their political destruction. These groups maintain many of the theological and philosophical traditions of the original order, though in much modified form. The Aga Khan, spiritual leader of many modern Ismailis, traces his lineage back to the assassin imams. In Western literature and popular culture, the assassins have taken on mythic dimensions that often obscure their historical reality. From medieval romances to modern video games, they appear as mysterious figures embodying both the romance and terror of the medieval Orient. While these portrayals are often inaccurate, they demonstrate the enduring fascination with their story. The medieval assassins remain one of history's most intriguing organizations, a group that successfully combined religious devotion, political sophistication, and military innovation to create something genuinely unique in the medieval world. Their story illuminates broader themes in medieval Middle Eastern history: the tension between religious authority and political power, the impact of the Crusades on Islamic society, and the ways in which small groups could exploit the weaknesses of larger political structures. Perhaps most significantly, the assassins demonstrated that dedication to an idea, properly organized and strategically applied, could challenge even the mightiest empires. Their legacy continues to resonate in our modern world, reminding us that the relationship between faith, politics, and violence remains as complex and relevant today as it was nearly 1,000 years ago in the mountain fortresses of medieval Persia and Syria. Their ultimate failure to create a lasting political state does not diminish their historical importance. Instead, it reminds us that even the most innovative and dedicated organizations must eventually adapt to changing circumstances or face extinction. The assassins' two-century struggle against overwhelming odds remains an extraordinary chapter in the complex story of medieval Islamic civilization.